Thank you guys for inviting me and putting me on the program. This has been a really great conference because I've got to learn a lot. I'm coming from a finance department, and this is what I think we can all agree, one of the classic prediction problems has been where are equity prices going to go. And so Ronnie Micheli, who's at University of Geneva, and I have sort of built an agenda looking at these market intelligence fintechs and what's happening in this space. And one of the papers that's coming out of this is one we're focusing a little bit more on the labor and asking, what is happening to the incumbents in this space in particular, and looking at the analysts. So this is a quote from Joyce Chang, who's head of global research at JP Morgan, and she said, with 80% of the data in the world created in the last 2 years, judgment matters more than ever. Technology is a complement to sound judgment and knowledge, not a substitute. So she was a strong believer in, no, the analyst job is not going away at all. And there's other people who have said, no, this is the final coffin. We're going to get rid of the analyst profession altogether. Why we think looking at the equity analyst here is really a great context is because almost everything they do is documented and documented really well. We know when they're making their recommendations to the precise moment. We also know when they're having meetings with management. We have a lot of information on their soft skills. We have a lot of this extra detail that we can get at questions like quality that sort of came up in several discussions as well. So I'm going to just sort of give you background on the space. In particular, market intelligence fintechs are what we would say streamlining and synthesizing many different data sources relevant for investment recommendations. At first, it was all about speed. More recently, it's been about scope. They're bringing in a lot of alternative data sets, primarily social media data sets, but this is the idea that you can take a satellite image of a Lowe's parking lot, you know how many cars are there, and so therefore you can predict sales way ahead. And there's a lot of companies doing this. When we did a paper just summarizing the 2 years ago, there was more than 300 companies basically selling signals to hedge funds or trying to market to a broader retail investor audience. So this is the particular fintech that we're going to draw from. It's called TipRanks. They are one of the largest. They are fully integrated into the E-Trade platform right now. They also sell their data and signals to hedge funds. That's actually where they make the bulk of their money. So what they did and why it's called TipRanks, originally they started saying, look, we're going to look at all these different types of experts and figure out who's the best. We can use our machines to do that. What they've done is now just sort of incorporate lots and lots of data sets and create a smart score, and they update these smart scores continuously, but they'll rank analyst opinions. Are you a good analyst? What's your score there? Are you a blogger? What's your score there? They'll look at social media data like Twitter. They'll say what's going on there. So look at hedge fund activity, insiders, a bunch of different things to create these scores. So Ronnie luckily sits on the board, and so he was able to get us this data. And so what we're going to do in the paper is use this data to try and understand then the competition between analysts and fintechs, and if it is competition or if it's complements or substitutes. And in particular, you have to understand that this industry has been trending quite a bit. The heyday for analysts was probably the dot-com bubble, where they were predicting all the good IPOs, and then sort of a bunch of regulation came out and said, no, you're basically violating all conflicts of interest. And so continually over time, they've sort of lost their relevance, but yet you go and ask any, I was actually at a conference 2 weeks ago with the guy who trains all of Goldman Sachs' new analysts each year, and he was like, they're still so important because they have to go and talk to the investors. They have to basically hold hands, and they have this very psychological role that they play to explain to them why they're making the recommendations. So the testable hypotheses we're going to pull out is some of the stuff from the task-based literature. We're going to ask, are analysts switching careers? So this is the extensive margin. We can look if they're quitting, they fall out of the data set. We can also ask, what stocks are they covering? So where we're going to get variation, yes, they're applying these AI algorithms on everything. Where we're getting variation is, not every place is like Lowe's. Not every place has this satellite image data that you can analyze. And so there's certainly equities that have way more data that can be analyzed, and some equities that barely have any data that can be analyzed. And so that's the variation that we're going to call sort of low AI and big data stocks. And then we're going to ask if they're switching their coverage. We're also going to ask if they're complements. So is the fact that the analysts themselves can use these AI methods, is that freeing up their time to focus on the soft skills? Is it freeing up their time to talk to management? Is it freeing up their time to talk to their investors who they want to buy their research? And then finally, what's really nice is we can get at product quality. Do they change the quality of their work? We're going to look at analysts are notorious for their bias, but we're going to look at their forecast errors. We're going to look at their optimism bias. And then we're going to ask, if we sort of hinting at what we find, which is the reporting quality actually, and this is maybe the surprising result, gets worse. Why is it getting worse? Is it that they're trying to get attention back? They don't like that the machines have taken all their attention, so they're strategically biasing it? Or does it have something more to do with effort and sort of the quality of the workforce? So I explained tip ranks data. The rest of it's pretty traditional, except for I would say that we did a lot of effort to get these meetings with management, which is sort of our attempt at trying to get at some of these soft skills. And that was pulled from a new data set that Bloomberg has available. So the regressions we're going to look at are sort of at the analyst stock quarter level. And we're going to be able to then look at these sort of intensity of AI, which we're going to base on the firm that gave us their data, and we're just going to say, how much data are you analyzing? Are you analyzing millions of pieces of data, or are you analyzing no data? If you don't like that measure, we've also done these things where we're just saying, is it increasing how much data you're analyzing, or is it basically flat? And both methods seem to go through. And then we're going to have a bunch of controls. Ultimately, though, you could say there's correlation for a bunch of different reasons, and so we're going to try and get at that with an instrument. The instrument that we're going to go after is looking at short newspaper headlines. And so to just sort of explain the relevance of this, you have to understand that the biggest alternative data source is coming from social media data. This is everybody who's basically posting on Twitter, but there's actually value relevance here. There's quite a few papers in finance that have now looked at different alternative data sources, and all of them seem to have 90% of them are flawed, but if you find the 10% of golden nuggets there, you are getting good investment advice. So what we're doing is saying, okay, if people see a short newspaper headline, which there's a lot of psychological evidence to suggest, then that makes them think about it, that then they will post something quickly on Twitter, they might write a blog post, that's going to create new data. We can test this relevance. It's going to certainly pass the first stage instrument that there's going to be more data when there's short newspaper headlines. Where you might be worried is that it conveys some type of sentiment or some type of content. This is over 7 million headlines. We're mostly pulling from the big national newspapers. We're not pulling from local newspapers. But if you'd see something like Nokia sues Apple, or there's a patent lawsuit, the difference between them, we have no R-squared explanation, and we have nothing coming up as significant in terms of 7 million headlines. So we think of it as generally, probably plausibly exogenous. So what we're going to do, and what we find, our main finding is on substitutes. Yes, we find analysts are leaving the profession. Actually, what we find most surprising is the analysts who are quitting are the best analysts. They tend to be the ones who are more accurate, which is going to get to our quality result in a minute. We also see them shifting their coverage towards low AI stocks, where they might have more value add. When we look at the complements question, we also get a yes. They seem to be turning to their soft skills advantage. That is, they're basically taking on more meetings with management in those low AI stocks. And then the product quality. This is probably the most surprising result, at least for us, was that it's not the traditional competition. If you think of AI as competition for analysts, it would reduce the bias. We actually find it go the opposite direction. You see an increase in bias. You also see a decrease in accuracy. Okay, and so what is explaining this? We don't see any evidence of strategic bias, them trying to sort of push away and get attention. We see it all coming from this less talented analyst pool, that essentially all the good people are quitting. Who's left or who's actually entering the profession is just not as talented of an analyst as the previous generation. And so in conclusion, our research question was to try and understand that what these people traditionally tasked with prediction work, how they're going to respond. And what we see is that for the high-skilled workers, they're going to focus on their soft skill advantage as analytics basically decline. And our next steps, and something that we actually was suggested to us by some of the analysts that we've interviewed who have sort of corroborated the story, at least for us, is to look at the conference calls. And so we have some preliminary evidence where we're looking at the questions they actually ask the CFOs and the CEOs on calls, and that they're pushing towards those harder to measure intangibles rather than the sort of easier to predict items like sales. Great, thanks.